Hello everyone and welcome to another TouchDesigner tutorial. Today's tutorial is going to be a little experimental and we're going to look at taking data that is stored in POPs, moving that into TOPs where we can do some image-based processing and then bringing that back into POPs before feeding that back and repeating that whole process multiple times. And what this technique allows us to create is a sort of 3D version of a reaction-diffusion simulation. And what's really nice about it is we can sort of do these changes that make it very, very improvisational. And we can sort of perform in multiple ways with this system. Before we get started building this more complicated technique, I want to quickly go over the concept of feedback in TouchDesigner. In TouchDesigner, we have this very handy ability to be able to take some input information, so in this case, a piece of noise, and run that through a feedback operation. And basically what this means is that everything between here and here is going to be a process in that feedback loop. At the end of that chain, I can feed this back into my input, which allows that processing to happen iteratively. And that allows us to create things like this reaction-diffusion simulation, where essentially I'm blurring and sharpening multiple times a second. We can see how this changes if I move this up and down in terms of the parameters. And you can see how varied these outputs are from changing a few small factors. And I like to think of these as a sort of an emergent system, a system that becomes complex from a series of simple rules. Really all we have here is a displace, blur, sharpen, and an edge. And the edge is sort of optional. I've just added that in as a sort of post-production-y effect to give a bit of a softer line. And what you'll see is it's actually very, very responsive because it's happening multiple times per frame. And this is the technique that we're going to apply and think about in a 3D environment. So I'm going to close up this session and start a new project, and let's begin. We're going to start off with a grid pop, and I'm not going to make this 3D in the slices Z-axis right now. I'm just going to update our columns and rows to 100 apiece. If I hit A on my viewer and hit W, I can show this subdivided so we can see all of those points. And I'm going to bring this out into a null and then into a feedback. This section is really to act as an input into our whole system, so we can just kind of switch out inputs into that null of different geometries. The reason that I like to start off this network using POPs before moving them into TOPs is that I want to use the attribute qualities of POPs ultimately in this kind of chain. From the feedback, I'm going to bring this into a POP2. So we're taking this and moving it into a image-based format. And what we can see here is the position and active. Just going to add in a keyboard in as well for later so we can update that feedback. But what we're seeing here is essentially something very similar to a UV map that we've used before. So let's see if I move this translate and update my feedback, because everything's being held by that. We can see that this geometry here, let's actually just have a real-time view of that really quickly, is ultimately changing those XY coordinates. And we could think about this as a UV map if we were working in TOPs. We actually want that at 0. And from here, we can do some image-based processing. So I'm going to bring in a blur, and I'm going to bring in a sharpen. So I'm going to go to my palette, go to image filters, and find a sharpen. We'll bring that in. Bring that into a null. And for now, this is the extent of our image processing chain. I'm going to put it down there, and I'm going to bring it out into a top to pop. So back already into pop world. And what we can see here is in our top to pop, we have a few ways of visualizing this information. And so right now we have this color. So we're visualizing the RGBA as a color component. And what we actually want to do is look at the position RGB. Right now it's not going to look particularly exciting because we're just using that XY UV map. But if I go in and bring in a noise, we'll see that it is displacing those points based on that RGB input. And if I just go back really quickly and view it in color, we're just seeing that texture in 3D space. So it's much more useful for us to view this as a position RGB. So that's really great. I'm going to bring this out into a null. And I'm going to bring this into a geo so we can sort of visualize our 3D environment. Okay. And this is the start of this network. I'm going to label this as end FB because this is going to be the end of our chain. We're going to add in more stuff to this, but this is basically the network kind of beginning. So let's drag this final FB onto our feedback. And let's see what's happening there. So already kind of an interesting effect. We're getting some sort of growing, easing effect, and it's expanding very, very fast. I want to add in a few things in my final top chain. And what I want to do is I want to add in a limit to start off with. And this will go right near my feedback. I'm going to set my limit to clamp between -1 and 1. And then we have something that's a lot more manageable. Let's start playing with some of these blur and sharpen elements. By doing that, we can see something that's kind of subdividing a lot more quickly. And let's also add in a little transform here and put that rotate to 1. And already we have something that's kind of interesting by just manipulating some of these parameters. Let's see what it looks like in 3D. I'm actually just going to copy this grid because what I have found is that if you have too many points in the system, it can quickly overload your machine. So I'm just going to do 20, 20, 20, and I'll just plug that in here. And now we should have something that is in a 3D environment. Also kind of a nice texture. And again, if you start playing with these elements, you get something that's kind of responsive. So you can start maneuvering these around to try and get different sort of effects. Let me just do a smaller rotate there, or even a 0. You could also apply things like a level in this point. You could see how the brightness allows you to enlarge and shrink that output. And let's try adding in maybe a greater axis of points on one edge. And you could just leave this sort of system like this, where you just start thinking about kind of combining the image processing to make these kind of visual changes. And that's something that can be very effective, but it's also something that could just be done in tops alone. But by leveraging pops, we can actually do a bunch of really interesting things. What I want to try and do in this section here is add in a line smooth. And this is kind of going to have an effect like the blur, where it sort of filters out some of the harsh movements in these points. However, what we have here is not something that we can actually process through this line smooth right now. So we actually have to make this into a bunch of lines. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to insert a connectivity pop, which is something I'll probably make a tutorial just as a standalone thing about at some point, because I think it's sort of underutilized but actually very effective. So I'll bring that in there. And what we can see is now we are connecting all those points via lines. particularly in this case, line strips. You can choose different methods, so you can have line strips. That's the one that's actually going to be effective for our line smooth, but you could also have zigzag per plane or spiral per plane. And you can see how that's slightly different there in terms of these outputs. But what I can do here is I can start applying things like that line smooth. And maybe let's take off that transform. Very nice. We start getting something that's kind of cool. And I'm going to take down the number of particles. I'll do like 30. There we go. I'm going to apply a noise. So there's lots of stuff that we're doing in this final section here to sort of make this exciting. Let's add in a noise. Let's abs time dot seconds it. And you can tweak that line move to get these sort of different effects. What you can also do at this point is you can apply things like a skin at the end of your chain if you want to have something that you can turn into a 3D volume. Let's see what this looks like as a 2D. Something that's important to do if you want to work with just a 2D visualization of this is just to check on your noise that XY. So now it's constrained to a 2D area. And let's apply some of this back in. Tweak some levels here, and a lot of this really is just sort of experimenting and seeing what works and what is interesting. And this is something that you can play with and improvise with as much as you like. But what I want to show you that I think is a particularly cool effect is using a point easing tool. So this is a GLSL component that I've made, and I'm going to flash up the video of me putting that together so you can kind of look at it and code it yourself. What this does is it basically looks at all the input points, and I can set things like the radius that they're going to push apart, the strength of that push, and the step size per frame. So let's bring that in. And let's just see how this changes if I turn that radius down. So we actually want a smaller radius to have these kind of collisions happening at a closer proximity. Having a strength that is high will increase that strength, or a step that is high will mean that goes faster. So right now there's quite a lot of stuff going on, and let's try taking these things down a little bit. So let's take off that noise, and let's take off the level and the transform as well. We can bring those in later. So this is just the point easing. So what I'll do here is I'll set the radius to 0.2, the step to 0.05, and the strength to 0.4. We'll add in some tweaks here. So we're going to turn down the blur, we're going to turn up the sharpen. And for the time being, I'm also going to turn off this connectivity so we can see what this looks like on a sort of a more point level. And we can see we're getting these sort of fun patterns. A lot of this work with feedback loops is sort of finding an equilibrium. So playing around with values, maybe turning down that strength. I want something that is going to be more consistently a pattern. And something else that I have found that's kind of an easy way of bringing things back into these original positions is adding in a math mix to blend between the final position and the input geometry. So let's make a select, and let's reference our null for our input in there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this into my math mix as the second input. On math mix, I'm going to set mix as my operation. In scope A, I'll use P, so the first grouping of points. And then in scope B, I'll use in P, which is my input geometry. And then I'll just mix between them using a very, very small value. Let's try 0.1. And you end up getting a little bit more consistency in your visuals because you're adding in a bit of that input image as well. Let's try adding in noise, and that's really, really way too much. Let's do like 0.01 on the amplitude. I'll bring back that connectivity too if we want. And you know what? That line smooth actually is really messing us up here. So we want the line smooth maybe at a very low level, so we still get some of that emergent sort of goopiness. Looking nice. I'm going to bring this into a grid, and let's see how that looks there. And again, what's going to look good as a 2D sort of version of this is going to look very different in 3D. So tweaking values is sort of a must for these types of systems. Let's play with that. Let's move the sharpen up a little bit. We could reintroduce some of these things if we wanted to. And again, working with this, so having a higher radius, higher strength, a lower step size. Okay, I think I want to bring up that blur a little more. And also let's make this noise XYZ. And really what this kind of type of effect is about is actually like feeling out values that are going to work for you and exploring a little bit. So between that blur and that sharpen, you can make a lot of interesting stuff happen. Again, I'm going to turn off this connectivity for the time being. Although what you can also do if you want to keep that line smooth in the mix is you can have all of that going on, and then you can just do a convert at the end if you just want to view the points. Do points to point primitives. Again, everything has an impact on the feedback system, so turning down that math mix as well gives you something kind of nice. Okay, we're getting somewhere here. I'm going to turn down the strength. This is just a lot of me like tweaking parameters, right? So bringing it back to our lines real quick, a technique that I like to use to actually render this out in a sort of a more volumey type way is I like to apply a skin, and then I like to apply a sprinkle. And what the sprinkle allows me to do is add in a lot more points to that sort of end render than I can actually start out with, if that makes sense. So if I have a 30 by 30 by 30, it's going to be relatively small if I just view those points. but by combining skin and sprinkle, I can visualize a lot more points, which I think is really useful. Another thing that can be kind of fun to do is just bring this out to a second geo and apply a line. So we're going to have two visuals here. We'll have our points and we'll have our line. Let's turn that down to like 1. This is all going to be rendered, so let's render that. I'm going to plug it into an out, flick this to panel, and then we'll do a camera. On the line, I want to change the color to white. I'm going to bring this down to like quite a small value, just so we have these kind of connecting points. And again, with the point sprite, we want that to be very low. And what I'll also do is, because I just like interactivity, I'm going to plug this into a camera viewport. Let's connect that up, and let's reference that in our render view, low battery. But now I can control that somewhat. Open parent parameters. And as we can kind of see in this other iteration that I built, if we get to the right sort of values, we can get these things that are actually really, really nice and sort of orderly. Let's try this here. We also get like a nice sort of flow field effect with all of our points if we view them in this sort of 2D plane. And sometimes in that plane, it can be nice to actually just turn off these lines. And then we just have that sort of 2D sort of swirl field effect as we move through. And again, what we can do is everything is going to be more volatile as we kind of play with these parameters. So a lot of this is really just at this point playing with parameters to get these types of effects that are going to look different and cool. My computer is kind of running low on battery at this point, so what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to stop here. I might make some more video later of some sort of different preset effects. I think this is a really fun network. The fun thing to do at this point is to actually just sort of experiment with putting in different processes to your different sections. So I mean, let's bring back a level. You can see that the brightness allows us to bring things up and down. Having things that are going to be interactive and sort of fun over time is a really nice effect. And also having it sort of set up like this, where you can turn off the rendering for both of your for your lines or your points, so you can choose what to view, is kind of really useful. Let's again bring down the blur. I might make a little video where I show you how to automate this as well. But essentially we have some really nice 3D sort of diffuse reaction-diffusion inspired point clouds here, and I think that's a really nice effect. And I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll be making a few more things to put out before the holidays, so stay tuned. Bye for now.